Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, welcome. My name is Abigail. Today I am going to be sharing my labor and delivery story. I gave birth to my daughter in November and the whole experience was chaotic, unexpected, and emotional. Before I start telling my story, I do want to give a trigger warning. I am going to be talking about birth, not necessarily in a graphic way, but I am not going to censor myself. I will also be talking about postpartum anxiety and depression, so if any of these topics are triggering to you, I would advise you not to watch this video. I'm not going to hold back because I went through a major surgery and a huge life change that honestly was kind of traumatic for me. I want to share my experience in hopes that I can help someone who went through a similar experience that I did. So before I get into the actual labor and delivery and hospital experience, I am going to give you a background on how my whole pregnancy was and how life was before this happened, because it does contribute to the story. I found out I was pregnant at the end of March. I was working full-time and my husband worked part-time and was in grad school to get his master's degree. Dan graduated in May and started looking for a job. In June, we found out that our landlord was going to be selling the trailer that we were living in, and we had to leave in 30 days. So we packed up everything and went to go live with Dan's parents. They are 45 minutes away from where we lived at that time. Dan still didn't have a job, so he started working part-time at my workplace just to get some money coming in. We ended up staying with Dan's family from the end of June until end of October. That's how long it took before Dan finally found a full-time job and we found a place to live. We ended up moving 3 hours away from Dan's parents, but we are now a lot closer to my family and most of our friends. We moved into our trailer on November 4th, I believe. Prior to that, at the end of October, I was staying with some friends and then my mom for a little while because at that point I was 34 weeks pregnant and we were planning to give birth at the hospital in that area, and I wanted to be close to the hospital just in case something happened. So a lot happened this past year, which led to a lot of stress. During this time, my pregnancy was not a complicated pregnancy at all. It was a very smooth pregnancy. I didn't have any complications, and baby was growing normally, which is important to note. So the labor and delivery story starts on Monday, November 13th with my 36-week appointment. So at this point, I was 36 weeks and 4 days pregnant for my 36-week appointment. During this appointment, I had a bedside ultrasound just to check to make sure that the baby was in the correct position, and my OB was very certain that she was in the correct position just based on how she felt my belly. She figured that she felt her legs up towards my ribs, so it was a huge surprise to find out that she was actually in fact breech. So that was problem number one. And then the next thing that she noticed was that she couldn't really get a good look at the amniotic fluid, and it looked low. So she recommended that we get a proper ultrasound just to check. And at my practice, they do have an ultrasound place, but they were completely booked for the day. So we had to go to the hospital to get an ultrasound there and to be monitored. So we drove to the hospital. I got hooked up on monitors, and we waited about an hour or two before the ultrasound. And when we finally got the ultrasound, the doctor doing it said that my amniotic fluid was normal, so that was not a concern. Then she started taking baby's measurements, and she didn't really say anything during that part, but I was noticing on the screen that she was measuring at 33 weeks when she was doing the measurements on the ultrasound, which is odd because I was 36 weeks, not 33. The doctor said that her heartbeat looked good and that the blood flow from her umbilical cord looked good, but she didn't really say anything else about, like, her measurements or anything. After that, we were sent back to the room, and we just needed to wait for the final results of the ultrasound. I think we waited another hour or so before the doctor came in to discuss the results of the ultrasound. So basically, yes, she was measuring small, and she was diagnosed with severe fetal growth restriction. Her estimated weight at the time was 4 pounds, 9 ounces, which was odd because she had been measuring normal through this whole pregnancy up until this point. The doctor really wasn't sure what caused it, but she thought that maybe my placenta was, in other words, retiring early, that it wasn't working the way that it should be working at this point in time, and that I would need to deliver early. So when she said that, I was thinking, okay, so maybe like a couple more weeks. She then told us on Thursday, in a couple days, that we would need to come back and deliver. We had a couple of options that we could do. We could either schedule a C-section, or we could attempt to turn her to face the correct way and induce labor. Dan and I were completely shocked, and we didn't have to make a decision right then and there as far as what we wanted to do. So we scheduled a follow-up appointment with my OB for the next day to discuss what I was going to do. So the next day, Tuesday, November 14th, we did a lot of baby prep before my appointment. We went to Target and grabbed some preemie outfits and preemie diapers because she was expected to be very small and we didn't have any preemie stuff at all. I had to stop into my workplace to fill out some paperwork for my maternity leave because it was now happening 3 weeks earlier than was expected. I did call my workplace after my hospital visit just to tell my boss what was going on. I was also told by the hospital that I shouldn't be working anymore, and I was supposed to work that Tuesday, so I also had to tell him that the doctor said that I couldn't work and that I would not be in until after my maternity leave. So in the afternoon, we had the appointment with my OB where we discussed the two different options, either scheduling a C-section or turning her and inducing labor. And ultimately what I decided was that I'm going to schedule a C-section. That seems to be the safest option because if we try to turn her, it could put her into distress, which could lead to an emergency C-section, which I didn't want that to happen. So I figured that scheduling a C-section would be the safest way to go. So we officially scheduled the C-section for 11 a.m. on Thursday, November 16th. We had also scheduled a follow-up ultrasound the next day, November 15th, just to check on her. On Wednesday, November 15th, we went to a building next to the hospital for our ultrasound at around 8 or 8:30. We had never been there before, so we ended up parking in the parking garage at the hospital and walking from there across the street to this other building. It was a lot of walking, and it really tired me out when we finally got there. I was just completely winded. Then when we got into the waiting room, it was completely empty. I didn't see anybody at their desks. There were people working, but there was like nobody at the desks. They were all like further back. So we just kind of waited a minute to figure out what to do. And then we heard this one receptionist go, "Hello, can I help you?" in that really rude tone to us. So we walk over to her, and my husband starts to answer, and then she says again, "Can I help you?" in that rude tone again. And that just kind of got to me for some reason, and it launched me into a panic attack. I was already like so tired from walking, and it was a stressful situation, and then this lady being rude to me was like it for me with the buildup of all of this stuff. Suddenly her demeanor changed, and she called for a nurse, and she was concerned about my health and was asking if I was okay. Dan was trying to calm me down and check me into the appointment, and he got me some water, and I eventually calmed myself down. I hadn't had a panic attack like that in ages. It was definitely something out of the ordinary. They called us in to the ultrasound, and this time the amniotic fluid was low. So now, after some discussion with the doctor, we were told to head over to the hospital to deliver the baby. So we were going to have a baby that day all of a sudden, and we didn't bring any of our hospital bags or anything. So we decided that as soon as I was checked in and had an idea of what was going on and what time everything was going to happen, that Dan would go home and grab our hospital bags. They were pretty much packed. There was just a few last minute things that weren't packed, like the daily things that we use every day. So we get checked into a labor and delivery room. This is about 9:30, I think, at this point. And the nurses come in and start to hook me up to monitors and an IV. And let me tell you that them putting the IV was probably one of the worst parts of my hospital stay. It hurt so badly because they kept missing. They did 2 attempts, and then on the 3rd attempt, they finally got it in my left arm. So they had it in there, but then after a little while, my hand started to swell up and it was turning blue. So they had to come in and remove it. And then they called in a specialist to use an ultrasound to find a vein and actually use that to put in the IV. So it took 4 attempts for them to get an IV in my arm without cutting off my circulation. Like I said, we got to the hospital at around 9:30, and I had eaten that morning, so they told me that the earliest that I could have my C-section was 3:30, since I ate at around 7:30, and you're supposed to fast 8 hours before the surgery. After the whole IV fiasco, it was just a lot of waiting after that. Dan went home real quick to grab the hospital bags, and I entertained myself by watching TV because there really wasn't anything else that I could do at that point. There was a Hunger Games marathon going on, so I watched that while I waited for my surgery. Then my C-section ended up getting pushed later because someone had to go before me. There was another emergency C-section that had to go before me, so I had to wait a little bit longer for it. And then finally, at 4:20 p.m., they came and got me to go to the operating room. They just took me first, and then they were going to come back for Dan when I was all set up for surgery, which was kind of scary that I had to go in there without him. There were a ton of people in the room. There were the doctors that were going to be operating on me. There were a couple nurses, some anesthesiologists, and there was also the NICU team, a group of people from the NICU team there, because the baby was expected to be very small and likely having to go to the NICU. So first they had me sit up and bend over so that way my lower back was out as much as possible, so that way they could put in the epidural. That was painful. I was sobbing in pain while the nurse was trying to console me and calm me down, and that pain went on for what seemed like an eternity of them trying to get the epidural in. Once it was in, it was okay. After that, I just got to lay down and wait for my lower body to numb. The doctors would do some tests to see if I could feel stuff, them doing anything, and it did take a bit. They tested me twice, and I still was feeling them. And then the third time they tried, I was completely numb. I didn't feel anything that they were doing. At one point, I started to feel lightheaded because my blood pressure started going down, which is one of the side effects of getting this epidural. So they put some medication through my IV to fix that, and I felt better pretty quickly. The nurse then brought Dan in to sit by my head for the surgery. And before the doctor started the surgery, they just kind of announced to the room that they were about to perform a C-section for a baby girl at 36 weeks and 6 days, who was breech, had low amniotic fluid, and was diagnosed with severe fetal growth restriction, meaning she was expected to be very small. I was surprisingly very calm at this point. As soon as Dan walked in, I was calm, just waiting for the surgery to start. I started chatting with Dan about the fact that we were going to meet our baby in a few minutes, which was going to be crazy. Then all of a sudden I heard the doctor say, "We've reached the uterus," and I was like, "What?" I didn't feel a thing up to that point. I didn't know they were operating on me already, but they had already reached the uterus. After they said that, I felt some tugging and pulling. There wasn't any pain. It was just movement and pressure. I felt everything happening, but it didn't hurt. Then at 4:54 p.m. was the moment that she was born. The nurses lowered the screen down a little bit, and the doctors held up the baby, and it was the most surreal moment. Her eyes were wide open, her skin was very blue, but she was looking right at me. She wasn't making any noise, so the doctors were getting ready to hook her up on some machines, and then all of a sudden she started crying. So they held her up again for a little bit longer so I could see her, because now she was making noise, she was breathing, she was okay. And like I said, her eyes were wide open and she was just looking right at me. They were able to do delayed cord clamping before they took her over to the NICU team. Dan went over to the NICU team to watch while I stayed on the table and they sewed me up. Again, I felt a lot of tugging, but there was no pain. Her APGAR scores were amazing. They were a 9 at 1 minute and a 9 at 5 minutes, which was pretty amazing. She weighed only 4 pounds and 4 ounces, which if she had weighed 2 more ounces, she wouldn't have had to go to the NICU. But because of her weight, she needed to go to the NICU to be monitored. I knew that was totally a possibility, and I was okay with that. I just wanted to make sure that she was going to be okay. Before they took her, they swaddled her up and brought her over to me and Dan held her next to me for a minute, and she started crying again, but that was a little bit of bonding time that we got with her before they took her to the NICU, and Dan went with them as well. So I was left alone again in the operating room. Then I was in the operating room for what seemed like forever, but I think it was only about 30 more minutes or so. The doctors told me I was the most boring C-section ever, which is a good thing because you want to be boring. You don't want anything bad to happen. They told me that they didn't have to cut through any muscles. They just had to move them, that I had a very strong core. So all those years of dancing paid off in this moment. Once I was finished, the team lifted me up onto a bed to roll me back to my room, and I would stay in the room for a few hours during my recovery before going to a mother-baby room. And I think I'm going to have to stop for a minute because Holly's waking up. All right, I'm back. She went down for a nap after having a bottle. So, continuing from where I left off, I got back to the labor and delivery room I was staying at. I was very loopy from the drugs that they gave me. And I also realized that Dan still had my phone and he was up in the NICU. So I told one of the nurses to go get him, and if he could come back to my room and get me my phone. Dan came back down, and soon after that my mom came to visit, and Dan took my mom to the NICU to meet Holly. 9 p.m. rolled around, and I still had not seen Holly ever since I gave birth. So I asked one of the nurses if I could go to the NICU to see her, and they're like, yeah. They had to wheel me in the bed to the NICU because I still couldn't move at all. But they took me there, and I got to hold her for the first time. We did some skin to skin at that moment because I didn't have a chance to when she was born. So the days following the birth were very, very difficult. It's honestly kind of a blur, and I'm probably not going to remember everything that happened. Whenever something in my life is traumatic or difficult, it's like my mind tries to void it out and forget that it ever happened. So I'm going to try my best. I've been processing everything that happened and talking about it all in therapy. So Thursday, November 16th, the day after I gave birth, I did manage to get out of bed and walk with assistance to the bathroom. So they took out the catheter that was down there, and by the way, they put that in during the surgery, and I did not feel it at all. And then once I was aware that it was there, I sort of became hyper aware that it was there, and I was just really glad to get that thing out. Visiting the NICU was really, really challenging because I was not very mobile. Whenever I wanted to go to the NICU, I needed Dan and a nurse to get me into a wheelchair because I could not walk. I should say I could walk, but very slowly. So there was no way that I was going to get to an elevator to the NICU on a different floor by myself. I had 2 visits that day with a lactation consultant. One was for breastfeeding and the other one was for pumping. Breastfeeding did not go well. She did not latch, and pumping went fine, but there was some concern that because I hadn't started pumping until the next day that I would end up with a low supply. And, you know, she wasn't wrong about that. I am a pretty low supplier. If I'm looking up, I have my notes behind the camera just so that way I don't miss anything that I wanted to talk about. So I had those 2 lactation consultant visits, and then I also had an initial visit with a social worker. She talked to me and Dan to just kind of get an idea about our situation. I did bring up that I had a history of anxiety and depression, and I think that is what started this roller coaster, was that they were now aware that I struggled with anxiety and depression and that I was medicated for it, and that put me at a higher risk of postpartum anxiety and depression. The next day after that, Friday, November 17th, I was still not walking very well, and I had another lactation consultant appointment to work on breastfeeding. We introduced a nipple shield for the first time, and that seemed to help a little bit with her latch. Again, there was concern brought up about my milk supply because I didn't start pumping until later on, and I also wasn't pumping as often as I should have been, and pumping very consistently. And then I was also under a lot of stress because of the fact that my baby was in the NICU and I was in a lot of pain from the C-section, so there was a lot going on that was probably compromising my milk supply. I didn't write down anything else that happened that day. I can't really remember either if there was anything specific that happened that day. Moving on to Saturday, November 18th, that was the day that I was originally going to be discharged. At the beginning of the day, I was feeling much better. I could actually get up and walk around independently. However, the doctor came in that morning and took off the dressing that was over my incision. It was basically like a Band-Aid covering the incision. And I felt like that it hurt, but I don't think it actually hurt. I think mentally I just thought it hurt, and I started sobbing because I felt like I was in pain again and that this was going to set me back because I was starting to feel better. And now that the dressing was gone, I felt like I was in pain again and had another hard time walking. I was very inconsolable. I felt like I was not ready to go home. I felt like I couldn't take care of my daughter. I was just inconsolable. I was very emotional about all of this, and just the doctor coming in and taking off the dressing kind of set that off. And this led to some concern about my capability of being a parent. Some of the nurses were questioning whether I was fit to be a parent, and that is something that no new mom who had just given birth a few days before wants to hear. And I had another visit with a social worker who recommended that I get a psych evaluation, and I agreed to it. I had the psych evaluation later that day, but there really wasn't anything that came out of it. The only thing that was suggested was upping my dose of Lexapro, which I've been on for years. So I'm on a higher dose now, and I think it is a good amount for me to be on right now for my mental health. And the hospital allowed me to stay one more night. They also told me that Holly was going to be discharged the next day as well, which made me happy that I was going to have one more night at the hospital and that I would be going home with my daughter. The last day I was there was Sunday, November 19th, and I woke up feeling good. I felt a lot better. I got discharged, and then we went to the NICU to wait for Holly to get discharged. While we were there, I had another lactation consultant appointment, and we were still struggling with the breastfeeding. So we were told to do a combination at home to try breastfeeding for 10 minutes on each side, then to pump and give her a bottle. And I will tell you later how that actually went in another video, because that was something that was not sustainable for us. So I'll talk about that later, and as far as what we ended up doing and what worked for us. After that, the doctors came in to talk about discharging Holly, but they were more concerned about my mental health and to make sure that I was mentally in a good state. And at that point I was on a higher dose of medication, and I felt a lot better. So we finally got to go home at like 3 p.m. I also want to add a little funny story to this. So throughout my pregnancy, I did not experience any swelling of my feet at all. But then after I gave birth, my feet swelled up, and I only had one pair of shoes with me, and they didn't fit when I went to go put them on. So I went from a 7 to a 7.5. My feet were now a half a size bigger, and I didn't have any shoes that fit me. So I had to walk out of the hospital in socks because I had no shoes or slippers or anything. So that is basically everything that I can remember from my hospital experience. I feel like I might have left some stuff out, but in a nutshell, that is what happened. And I am really sad that my hospital visit went the way that it did. There was so much that could have been done so much better. For one thing, there was no communication at all between the NICU and the mother-baby care unit where I was staying. So the NICU had their own expectations as far as what they wanted me to do, while the mother-baby unit had their own expectations of what they wanted me to do, and they often collided with each other. So, like, for example, Holly's feeding time was typically at the same time that I needed to be checked or given medication, and which they often told me I had to be in the mother-baby care unit in order to do that. So I couldn't be up in the NICU at that time. Another complaint that I have is that we were first-time parents, and we were not really taught about how to take care of our baby. We went as far as making a physical list of things that we wanted someone to help us learn, such as giving her a bath, and we wanted to be able to practice these things, changing her diaper. Obviously, we worked a lot on feeding her, but that was about it. Some of the nurses were kind of helpful in letting us do that, but most of them really didn't bother. We just kind of had to learn how to take care of her when we got home. So I would say that that was probably one of my biggest complaints, was that I felt so unprepared to take care of my baby, even though I made requests to be taught these things, and they did not honor those requests. I also do want to comment that my mom also advocated for me. She told me this after the fact, but she talked to one of the nurses that I wanted to learn how to take care of my baby, that I wanted, more help with breastfeeding and all of that. And the nurse just told her, well, then she needs to make the effort to do so. And I was making the effort. I had just had a major surgery. I couldn't walk. I was in a lot of pain, and I was also separated from my baby. We were on 2 separate floors. It was so hard for me to go back and forth between my room and her room, and yet I wasn't making an effort. It would help if I could have gotten the support that I had requested to know exactly what I was supposed to be doing. I know that every experience is different, but hospitals in general need to do better at supporting new moms, especially in situations where they are separated from their babies. Okay, I'm going to stop because I could rant on and on and on about this. So if you made it this far into the video, thank you for listening. I hope that nobody has to have an experience like mine. Leave a comment down below if you want to share your birth experiences. I like hearing other people's stories, which is why I wanted to share my story. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to give it a like. My next video is going to be a vlog, so if you are not subscribed, be sure that you are so you don't miss my next video. You can also follow me on Instagram and TikTok. All of my links are listed in the description, and I will talk to you guys in my next video. Bye!